to get started by thanking everybody for joining. I imagine that people are on a lot of broadcasts and webinars right now. It's an interesting new way. I know myself, I've been hosting and been on quite a few of them. And they're interesting. It's this new way of working. I find it intriguing, but also sometimes it can be overwhelming. And what I wanted to do today, the reason that we're putting one on, is because we have access to all of this interesting data around what's going on in branded content. And we're looking at it every day and we're getting a lot of questions about it. And we felt like this was a way to be able to talk to a lot of people at once. And then we saw that there was a couple of other great companies, Outbrain and Gupta Media, that were doing something very similar. They had access to this really interesting data on what's going on in the branded content space, the native space, as well as social. And they were generous enough to come on here and share that data as well. So really looking forward to getting into this. We have some amazing panelists. I want to thank everyone for attending, and we're going to do a fun little poll here because I think we need to, during this time, we really need to celebrate the little wins that we may be having. So I'm going to do a quick poll just to see if we're going to find out. I showered this morning and I'm super happy with that. I'm also wearing a collared shirt today. So this is the first time I've done that in 2 months. And I feel like I'm dressed for church. I basically feel like this is the most dressed up that I've been in 2 months. My kids said to me this morning, they said, "Ooh, you look nice." And I'm wearing jeans and a collared shirt. So we know that their expectations have been lowered pretty significantly. So I'm happy to see in this poll right now that we have 61% of people have showered today. So congratulations, everybody that did that. And 12% of people have asked for us to just mind our own business, which is a very reasonable response as well. So what we're going to be covering today is we're going to be looking at data from 3 standpoints. We'll be looking at branded content, meaning the content and articles and videos that publishers are producing for advertisers, and how many stories are being published right now, how many page views or views those are seeing, as well as whether engagement has changed. And this is press board data. We work with thousands of publishers, and we've aggregated that data together so that we can see what's going on and looking at the changes over 2020 so far. We'll also be going through some data provided by one of our panelists, Matt from Outbrain, and that's really interesting. Outbrain has such a wide reach across the web. You know Outbrain for those recommended stories that you might see, and they have some really interesting data on what's going on, even topic related around what's happening with coronavirus content versus non-coronavirus content. And then we also have Gupta Media, Gogi, the founder of from Gupta Media, who has this really interesting viewpoint on Facebook and Instagram because of just the number of campaigns they're running, the number of impressions. And what's interesting about this is that Facebook and Instagram, they don't release their CPM data on a daily basis, but Gogi and the team are able to analyze the campaigns that they're running and provide us with some really great signals. So we are going to, I'm going to end this poll right now about the showering. So 54% of people showered, just so you know, and we'll have a couple of additional polls. So I'm going to share these results right now. Congratulations, everybody that showered. And you know what? If you didn't, I think that's just fine. You'll do it this week. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is what I've seen different. So I'm old enough to have gone through the 2008 recession in the advertising market. And that recession, if I were to compare it to what's going on right now in 2020, I'll use a theme park analogy. So I'm going to use the analogy of 2008, I remember going through it and we were really climbing. The ad spends were climbing, everything was going really well. And then we hit the financial crisis and things kind of flattened for a while. It wasn't really a decline yet. There was several months where everything was fairly flat. And then we had this slow decline. And if you think about it, I think of this as like a log ride. You have this nice casual up, then you have this flat part, and then you have a nice down, and then you're flat again. Now, what's I've noticed in 2020 in just the last few months is that we had this really steep kind of click, click, click all the way up until almost exactly to the date, kind of that March 5th timeframe, right around then, when COVID really hit North America with lockdowns. And then we had just like come over the edge straight down, just like a roller coaster. So 2020 to me has been a roller coaster. This really steep downwards. And then we don't really know what's happening from week to week now, where sometimes we're upside down, sometimes we're back up, sometimes we're down. And I think we all agree that we feel a bit nauseous through it. So if I were to compare these two times, 2008 felt like a log ride, and this feels a lot like a roller coaster. And you're going to see some of that in the data as well. I'm really happy to have a few panelists here. We have 3 panelists today. I'm going to introduce each of them by name, and I'm asking them to share a little bit about themselves. So let me flip off of this screen share for a second, and then you'll be able to see everybody. All right, so I'm going to start by introducing, let's start with you, Gogi. So Gogi Gupta is the founder of Gupta Media. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. You know, in addition to running the agency, I look after a technology platform called Smart URL, look after another creative agency called VeryLike, and we recently acquired a web development firm called Press Foundry. So I think what that gives me is a sort of broad base of the advertising landscape. And, you know, we have a number of big clients, a number of small clients. So when I come at these problems, I usually have, you know, it's not just a media solution or a technology solution or a creative solution, it's a broad-based solution. And I think that's helped us and our clients weather this log ride, as you referred to. Maybe Tower of Terror is better.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Gogi. And you win for the nicest looking home office. I am broadcasting from a basement in North Vancouver with a beautiful view of our water heater and furnace. So
I am in a basement west of Boston, so still in the basement.
Nicer basement than mine. All right, thank you. Next up, Trisha. Trisha's from Pressboard. I know Trisha very well, obviously. She's our Vice President of Partnerships. Trisha, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I am broadcasting from a tiny little town in New Jersey in the country called Branchville, and I'm in my bedroom. So yes, as Jared mentioned, I manage partnerships at Pressboard. We partner with publishers, with brands, with agencies, and we help them measure and report on branded content programs. Prior to joining Pressboard, I came from the agency world. I ran my own digital media agency in Canada for 10 years. And then when I sold the business, I really did have an interest in getting into the branded content space and industry. I really felt the pain points from the buying side with planning, executing, managing, measuring branded content programs. So when I met Pressboard, it was a really natural fit to kind of work with them and help them build up the business.
Awesome. Thanks, Trisha. And last but not least, we have Matt Peterson from Outbrain.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, so I run the partnerships for enterprise brands as well as premium publishers here at Outbrain on the advertising side specifically. Prior to Outbrain, I had actually co-founded a content marketing platform based in Atlanta. We worked with both brands, agencies, and publishers to, at that time, sort of establish content marketing programs. So that company was ultimately acquired by Outbrain, which brought me to where I am today and to New York, and now to Austin, broadcasting from not a basement, but a small home office here that overlooks our little backyard. So we've got at least a little window to look out of from my side.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining. We're going to go through all of the data. I'll go through the data just for consistency, and then we'll go into a panelist discussion towards the end. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen here. There we go. And let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. So the idea here is there is no real crystal ball as far as, you know, we don't know what's going to happen, but at least we can look historically and see what has been happening. So the idea here is let's share as much of this data that we all have as possible, and then use it to be able to make insights and recommendations to our customers, to our clients, to our vendors, to our partners, and our coworkers. So just as a very, very top level, what we're seeing here is just this really high volatility. We are seeing The number of, when we talk about branded content, stories being published by publishers, we are seeing a drop in stories published on a week-by-week basis when we compare pre-COVID. And when I say pre-COVID and post-COVID, just so everyone knows for the rest of this, pre-COVID, we're looking primarily, most of this data is coming from North America, North American clients, and most of the audience is here in North America. And really pre-COVID happened that first week of March leading up to that time. And then post-COVID, or where we are right now, is basically after that time frame. Some interesting things, we are seeing views per story increasing, and that's a pretty common theme that you'll hear across Twitter and Facebook and almost anyone who has inventory or has web pages that people are looking at, apps, is that consumption has increased quite a bit. And then on engagement levels, which is scrolling behavior and active time, we're seeing that relatively stable. That doesn't seem to change much depending on what's going on in the world. It takes people about the same time to read an article or look at a video if it's branded content. That's been relatively stable. We're seeing some really interesting things with Outbrain's data. This big spike and then come back down, and I'll get into it in a second. And then around social, both Facebook and Instagram have experienced quite a bit lower CPMs, which can be seen as quite an advantage for marketers that are still in the market because you can buy a lot more with a lot less, as well as Outbrain's CTR's click-through rates increasing. So I'm going to continue to go through this and dive a little bit deeper. So you're going to see some line graphs. Anytime you're sharing data, you're going to see some line graphs. So we will be sharing a recording of this afterwards. You don't have to be jotting down these line graphs in your notes right now. We'll be sharing it with all attendees. And what we've seen so far when stories are published is you'll see in this green area, which is the pre-COVID time, this really strong increase in the number of stories that have been published. And we took that average of that January 1st all the way to February 28th, which is when we had a peak of number of stories being published by publishers. And then we averaged that out, and that average is the orange line you see across the middle. So what we're looking at on the blue line, which is over to the right, is what happened after February 28th. And you'll see, as I mentioned, this looks like a roller coaster. There's almost a loop in the middle of it, you could see. So a pretty steady decline, pretty significant, down to the point where March 27th, the week ending March 27th, there were only 41% of the pre-COVID 2020 averages. So only, out of every 10 stories that may have been published pre-COVID, only 4 were being published in that week ending March 27th. And then we saw a couple of blips, a couple of sharp increases at the beginning of each month. And there's a few reasons for this. We've seen this in our data before. A lot of the people that use Pressboard software to measure their content campaigns are magazine publishers. And those magazine publishers often have a lot of their stories publishing similar to a print calendar where they're going up at the beginning of the month. And then we also do see the end of the month being also a time where we see a lot of page views and stories published. And it's just a natural part of the way that a lot of branded content studios publish their work. So we do see these spikes kind of in that last week of March, early April, and then it goes back down and flattens out around this 50%, and then we're seeing a spike again. So overall, if we compare the post-COVID average to the pre-COVID average, we're down about 19% in the number of stories that are published. Now, when we look at page views have increased. So there are fewer stories being published, but those branded content, sponsored content, branded content pieces are actually up in views by about 14% on average. And we're seeing a similar spike towards the end or early part of each month. But overall, there are more people looking at branded content. It's just they're looking at fewer pieces in general. And just so you know where this data comes from, Pressboard works with, like I said, about 1,000 publishers. Most of the major media companies that you would know already, news publishers, video publishers, everyone from NBC and USA Today to Globe and Mail and Glacier Media, et cetera. And so this is an aggregate of all that data all in one graph. And then when we look at the views per story, it makes a lot of sense that the views per story have increased, because if you have more page views on fewer stories, your average per story page view has increased really significantly. So on average, it's up 44%. And what that means is if you're an advertiser and you're doing branded content right now, you are likely seeing nearly 50% increase in how many people are looking at your pieces of brand content. So that's from the press board data. We wanted to share that. As far as the engagement goes, like I said, it stayed relatively stable. So we see an average of 43 active seconds on a piece of content, and we're seeing that stay within a 5% plus or minus range. Same thing on how far someone scrolls through. If it's an article, normally we see that right around 47% as an industry benchmark, and we're seeing that stay relatively the same as well. So Trisha, this is all press board data that you're familiar with. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the changes that you've seen in branded content in comparison to, you know, other types of formats like maybe display or social, et cetera.
Yeah, so there's a really interesting data point that the IAB released, and it's that there's been a 38% decline in digital media and advertising. And I think what's really interesting from our data is that on average, there's been a decrease of 19% with branded content. So it looks like branded content is faring better. My kind of takeaway from that, and after, you know, talking with publishers and brands, is that branded content naturally lends itself better to education, providing information, maybe being entertaining versus a sales message. So also what our data showed is that there was a steep decline in stories being posted when the lockdowns began in early March. So what happened was a lot of brands paused their campaigns, reassessed their messaging, worked with publisher content studios or internally, and came back to market with content where they could communicate with their consumers about more so how their product or service is helpful in the current environment, or with empathy and really relating to the current environment.
Yeah, that makes sense. It does take a little bit longer to get content created, and your messaging might be, you know, something that you were saying in February might not make as much sense in March after lockdowns.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for that. Now we're going to jump into distribution. This information is all coming from Gupta Media, which Gogi is the founder of, and it's incredible. I came across this a couple of weeks ago, and I found it really interesting, this idea of, you know, Gupta Media, which is an agency, looking at all of the campaigns and all the billions of impressions that they have, and then being able to see how that has changed over time. So this first graph that we're looking at is a comparison of different countries. And what's really interesting about this idea, so if you're looking at this graph, this is Facebook and Instagram data in 2020. This is the CPM rate, so the cost per 1,000 impressions. And different countries are experiencing quite different changes in the cost to run ad campaigns on Facebook and Instagram. You'll notice that teal line, which represents India, has had the most significant drops of the major markets, down sometimes as much as 70% in the cost of the CPMs. And then you have other countries that are faring a little bit better. Australia, for example, is only experiencing about a 10 to 20% decline for the most part. And this is an interesting way to be able to look at that over time. But most countries, most major markets, are somewhere between that 30 and 40% drop in the CPM rate when averaged across Facebook and Instagram. And I'm going to go through a couple more data points that Gupta Media was able to provide us, and then Gogi, I'm going to get you to add some insights onto this as well. So next is Facebook CPMs globally. Now, this is a year-over-year chart. So that light gray or light blue line that you see is 2019 at the same time as this year. So the dark blue line is 2020, the light blue line is 2019, and you can see the difference in the average CPM. And what this allows for is taking seasonality out of it. So maybe Q4 is a big time for CPMs at any given time, and so you don't really want to compare Q4 2019 to Q1 2020. And what this graph provides is a year-over-year comparison of the same time in each 2019, 2020. And you'll see that's a very significant drop. You have the two lines being relatively close together, even in early January, where globally there was COVID happening and lockdowns happening. And then you have where it hits North America here, and you see this really large discrepancy, this big drop in CPMs. Overall on Facebook, globally, there's a 52% drop in the cost of CPMs. And when we look at Instagram, it's a little bit less of a drop, but a 45% drop, and we're looking at the same type of thing there. Now, when we get into the US has experienced a lower drop and I mean, everything's relative. Even when we're talking about branded content, 19% starts to look okay as a drop, but that's significant. When you used to see just a climb all the way up, a 19% drop is almost unheard of in the ad business. Everything always goes up and to the right for the most part when you're looking at trends. So a 33% drop in the US is significant. The costs in the US are higher than globally. The averages are higher. So what we see here is an average CPM of $4.42 in 2019 in May, compared to $3.36 in May in 2020, in that first week of May. And that's Facebook and Instagram CPMs. And we look at Canada, we have a similar story. Rates are a little cheaper in Canada. So $3.24 was the average CPM on Facebook and Instagram in May 2019, compared to $1.91, which is a larger drop, but from a lower base as far as the cost goes. So Gogi, I'm gonna ask you to provide some thoughts and insights on what you've seen from this data, because you are tracking this on a daily basis and have been for some time now.
Right. I think that what ad marketplaces like this do is give you sort of a real-time look into how the world is thinking. And what we have to be able to tell our clients is, is this a good time to advertise? Is this a bad time to advertise? And that argument shifts as the prices shift, right? So if we don't have a broad view of what that marketplace looks like, I think our advice is narrow-minded. What might be, it might be a moment to pause at a 10% discount, and it might be a moment to accelerate at a 90% discount. But if you don't know that information, then you can't give good advice. We're not usually this benevolent, to be honest, but we don't have these type of crises that often. So one of the analysts on my team, Alex Palmer, pulled this data. He has nothing but time, and got to work one morning and he said, "Hey, I have this thing." And my first instinct was we should share this book, because I think exactly how you said. It's just interesting data, and it lets us all as a sort of ad community make good decisions and give good advice. And so, it's a little bit capitalistic, but that's our contribution to society right now.
Yeah, it's same with us. We'd never shared the data this openly before, but you just start to hear a lot of, it's almost like you start to hear a lot of stuff in the news, and you hear this anecdotal, and you realize that a lot of it is myths. So sharing that data at least provides a baseline for people to have discussions around. Do you have any thoughts on how marketers can act or start entering the market again if they've been holding for a while?
Sure. I think that this is one of those situations where the opportunity is starting to close up. So if you're listening in and you can be aggressive, 3-4 weeks ago was the right time to be aggressive. I think as the end is sort of now on the far horizon, it is, some of those deals are starting to close up. We look at it and we say, I think that the general, if you look at the press, how people think this is going to turn back on is different than how I think it's going to turn back on. By and by, the large travel companies, the hotel chains, which generally makes a huge part of the online ecosystem, advertising ecosystem, has been off. Airbnb is not advertising. That was an $800 million a year ad spend. All the big airlines, Booking.com was spending $5 billion a year with Google. Those are all off. But if they're saying, we're going to start flying July 1st, that means May 15th, 6 weeks ahead of that, they're starting to advertise. And we're sitting here on May 7th, so we have another week before, the airlines start advertising. And you can sort of, as the strain on Amazon's warehouses comes down, clients that use Amazon to fulfill their orders, they can start thinking about advertising. And we start getting this unlocking where we really had like pure play digital advertisers for a while. And now the brands and the D2C stores are all coming back.
Yeah. It's interesting, that idea that maybe there's this time where it's cheap to advertise, but the challenge is if you don't have the money or the cash flow to be able to advertise in that time, how do you take advantage of it? It's a lot like the stock market. Maybe stocks are low, but do you even have the funds or investment capital to be able to invest in that time? But I think you're right. Even just looking at the way that those Facebook and Instagram graphs are looking, they're starting to climb back up again. So maybe that window of opportunity is a short-lived one in general.
Right. And I think that, some of the D2C marketers had a moment where they were seeing, cash returns same day on a transaction. So they were able to both take advantage of the cheap CPMs and the advertising, or have the cash flow to buy that advertising. So they really lucked out.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you very much for that. We'll return to you when we get into the panelist questions. So next thing that I'm going to do is touch on some data that came in. Matt from Outbrain provided this and their business intelligence team. And we're going to talk around, this is more like news volume, if you think about it that way. So what we're looking at here is the percent change in Outbrain's network, total network page views. We're looking from, towards the end of January towards mid to late April. And there's this incredibly significant spike of over 30% increase in the total page views that Outbrain was seeing across their network, which is, I think, Matt, you'll be able to add some color to this and insights to this, but that seems like a significant spike. Would that be right?
Yeah, it's a massive spike. And Jared, where this data is coming from, Outbrain's installed across thousands of publishers, code on page. So we get some really unique insights into what people are reading and what kind of content is trending. And to your point exactly, and I think you have another slide to speak to this, the content around the pandemic and health concerns these days is driving, unsurprisingly, a ton of user engagement and interest.
Yeah. If we take that spike that we see in the previous one and we break it down, and I told you we're going to see a lot of line graphs here, different colors of line graphs though, different layouts, but anytime you're looking at we have a data scientist on our team, and anytime you're looking at something over a time frame, it's going to be a line graph. There's not going to be a lot of pie graphs or anything else when you're looking over a time frame. But you'll see this orange line, which is COVID-related content, seeing this spike, and then other content in general, seeing almost like a slight decline, but relatively stable across there. So this spike is almost entirely made up of COVID-related content, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And the dates on this, I recognize, are a little bit cut off as to what's sort of current today. But even extrapolating that out, it's a similar roller coaster as you presented earlier, right? We saw a massive spike in coronavirus content and engagement across the web, in mid-March, et cetera. And then even today, that trend line is coming back up. Corona, of course, is still very much top of mind. But other categories are starting to creep in. So you've got things like entertainment, recreation, home and lifestyle, and electronics, types of content categories starting to spike a little bit today, which is interesting in one regard and probably unsurprising in another, in that we're all stuck at home, and what are you looking to do is figure out what can you do while you're here under sort of a semi-quarantine. So the trends and relationships amongst what's trending in content production and consumption, and along with sort of user interest and the potential juxtaposition therein is really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And then on another part of with Outbrain is we're seeing this really high increase in click-through rates. And, we're looking at CPMs in social, so CPM costs have come down. But when we're looking at click-through rates on Outbrain's native network, there's been a significant increase. If we look at desktop, it's gone from 11.11% at the end of the year, and now we're at the beginning of April, it's at 0.61%, which is an incredible increase. What would you attribute this increase in a click-through rate on native ad units to?
Yeah, and I think, we've touched on it a little bit across, the other panelists as well. And one of the sort of key themes here that I'm drawing from the data is, people are still interested in understanding what brands are doing today. The messaging has shifted, so you don't want to be sold to necessarily. You want to be understand, I should say, how you're going to be supported by these brands. So there is, and you saw in the press board data, there's higher engagement, higher pages per session on branded content. And we're seeing the same kind of correlating trends. People are simply engaging with and clicking into this type of format more than they have in the past.
Interesting. And with all this, so we're seeing, I'm going to start moving into some panel questions as well. But before we do that, Matt, we're seeing that, you know, one thing that Outbrain does is promote branded content for public. That's what publishers will use it for. But I believe people use Outbrain for, even publishers and advertisers use it for a lot of other scenarios. Have you seen native ads being used for things maybe other than advertising related? So are there any other signals or trends that you've seen as far as how people are trying to change their business models or revenue streams?
Yeah, and I think you touched on it in some of the other graphs as well. Like the production of branded content, for example, is down a little bit in response to coronavirus. CPMs and such are dropping across platforms as well. So publishers in particular and advertisers in general are looking for other ways to make sure they're still top of mind or engaging with consumers with the right kind of toned messaging. And I think with the trends that we're seeing, say publishers is one example, is how do you build on a one-to-one relationship with consumers, right? And it's less about now making sure your impressions are served as one example, and how do you sort of drive and derive the loyalty from users that ultimately will sort of sustain a long-term business focus. So we're seeing that kind of mentality from pubs, for example, with subscription acquisition efforts and generating and creating podcasts that engage with consumers in a different sort of format. And I think we're seeing the same kind of trends in the brand world as well for more traditional advertisers, you know, putting good messages out there. How are they supporting communities in this time? How are they sort of driving the good in the world, aside from the products they're producing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this idea of, I mean, it had already started this on the publisher side, the idea of revenue diversification. And I think it was about growing revenue at a certain point. You know, let's add more different revenue streams. That's how we're going to grow our revenue over time. And then you move into this part where advertising revenue might be hitting a big decline, and now you're looking for replacement revenue a lot of times. So do you think that that's expedited this move towards a more diversified revenue stream? It's a bit of a shock to the system to all of a sudden have maybe something you thought would happen over 3 years happen in 3 to 4 days.
Yeah, to say the least. I think it's been and we've seen it on the Outbrain side too. I mean, the trends and the way that we're working with different partners has been diversifying over the years. And especially that has accelerated over the last, few months. But I think when the pandemic hit, to say that, it was a shock to the collective system as to how to remain relevant and engaging and sort of driving that consumer one-to-one relationship, and has put a rocket booster on these strategies so that, they've had to bring a lot of that to the forefront, and that becomes now, instead of to your point, kind of a passive strategy that will build over, time, something that's now a core focus of consumer engagement and advertising and messaging and all of the above.
Yeah, definitely. Well, with that, I'm going to lead into a couple of questions for the audience there. There is a Q&A, I believe, that you can access. I've seen a few people put questions into the chat, which is fine. We'll respond to any of the questions that come in there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and bring all the panelists into view a little bit easier. There we go. So, all right, well, let's chat about not only just what this data means, but also other things that we're seeing anecdotally. So the first question I have is that came from the audience, was around around the idea of brand safety. So this has always been a topic. This is always a fun, polarizing topic is, what is brand safe content, and the things that are most, especially in the news. We've had, probably a few years of interesting political news coverage, especially in the US. So this idea of branded content, branded safety around content has been always an issue, but it seems like in the last little while, to go to Outbrain's slide there, where a lot of this new content is COVID related, and you have brands that are maybe saying, hey, we don't want to be too closely associated with that. I'm wondering what the panelists' thoughts are on brand safety right now, when almost all that's being consuming out there is COVID related content, and that seems like the way. I'm actually going to start with you, Gogi, if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think I think if you're listening in, I think that people are trying to be ahead of the curve marketers, and I think part of being ahead of the curve is actually being ahead of the curve. And by the time we're sitting here on a panel saying like everyone's getting COVID fatigue, the consumers are already fatigued. So we've been trying to get our clients to think about how they play offense, how they are the first ones to start talking about business as normal, and not in a way that seems tone deaf or lacks empathy, but in a way that says like, if everybody is still talking about what was happening 3 weeks ago, the winner is the one that starts pushing that and saying like, shipping times are returning to normal, have fun. We're going to need that. I think that brands that can thread that needle do a really nice job. I saw an ad that really struck me. I have 3 daughters. And the ad was from Athleta, which does, exercise clothing. And the first ad I saw at the beginning of the lockdowns that we're all going through were, 3 young girls. They were all clearly of different families, and they were all playing together. And that felt totally tone deaf. And a few weeks later, there was an ad that said, the best clothes for at-home PE. And it was one girl by herself on a jump rope. And that was a much better ad. So I think it took a minute for people to find their footing. They did that. And now it's going to take another minute for them not to be talking about stay at home, but how to enjoy the summer and return to life as normal and all those things. So, we do have to be thinking where the world is in, a few weeks from now.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then Matt, I'll pass this over to you as well. I'm going to ask each of you what your thoughts are on that topic. So Matt, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's, there's a balance, I think is like an easy answer. And I think Gogi is a great point where the messaging needs to be forward thinking. It needs to be supportive of certainly and sort of on tone, if that's the right way to put it, as to what's going on. I think there's also validity in that this is hugely top of mind by a lot of consumers. And as we've seen in a lot of other kind of IAB studies and things like that, brands, publishers seen this massive spike in page views, and ultimately in the advertising ecosystem, this huge amount of supply available. But at the same time, they're not monetizing it as well because brands are very, to say, gun shy about advertising against, what could be considered a not brand safe environment. And we've seen similar trends certainly, but I think we've seen a lot more, especially in recent days, of brands and publishers as advertisers sort of leaning into that understanding of this isn't to say going away, right? People are interested, there is a level of fatigue, and there is an importance on having the right kind of messaging to it, but it's also where the users are, right? They are consuming a lot of content around coronavirus or related subject matters, right? About home fitness or home education. My wife's a teacher, so all of these things about how do you manage your children at home while they're not being in school. So there's so much that is relevant and related to Corona topics that I think we are starting to see brands get a little bit more comfortable with advertising in environments that historically would be kind of as a knee-jerk reaction off color. Yeah. So it's I think a promising turn, and as Gogi said before, I think we're starting to hit an inflection point where brands are going to get more active in the ecosystem again, and that's going to become part of this like new normal.
Yeah. And Trisha, from a branded content perspective, what are your thoughts around the brand safety? What have you been hearing in the market?
Well, I love that branded content really does lend itself to a very safe environment, because branded content is usually hosted on its own page. That is the content. The question is about the promotional units, and often promotional units are running through, for example, like an Outbrain or on Facebook, where there is a lot of COVID related content. I think because, like Matt had said, there's kind of COVID fatigue, it is our new normal. I think at the beginning there was some sensitivities around being adjacent to that kind of content, but I think it is becoming the new normal to have your brand alongside that type of content.
Yeah, that makes sense. Even if you do own your environment when you are, watching the branded content video or you're in the article, there has to be a way for people to get to that. So you have this, it's this tough choice to say, okay, well, here's where everybody is. They're paying attention to it. Trying to find people that aren't talking about something related to coronavirus is nearly impossible. So I don't know who you would be talking to over in this other corner of the world or of the internet. Well, thanks for that. So I have another question, but before I do that, I'm going to pop up another poll. I am going to see if I can pop up. It's not the same poll as before. I'm going to ask a question around when people think we're going to see a return to normal. So we all know this is guesswork. No one knows this answer. We can look at historical data, but it doesn't necessarily tell what the future is going to be. But I'm just curious to get people's thoughts. I'm going to allow the panelists to vote on this as well, on when you think we'll return to a normal, and I'm using air quotes for the normal ad spend, but just to where it feels a bit more regular. So I'm going to launch this poll now. You should see it. And let us know if you think it'll be within the next month, within the next 6 months, which is November 2020, in about a year, 2+ years, or never. And we'll let that poll run for a little while. And we're already seeing a lot of people coming in. I love how, by the way, this audience is amazing. They're answering the poll super quickly. Everyone's getting some answers in there. And it looks like we're ending up somewhere around that within the next 6 months to a year time frame. Actually, it's significantly, that's the feeling that people have, which makes sense. It doesn't feel like it's within the next month. It doesn't feel like it's going to be never, but we're probably looking towards fall to next year. And again, this is all guessing. We're not sure exactly what that's going to be. So thanks to everyone for submitting those responses. We'll have one more poll at the end. I do have another question. I'm going to share these results. There we go. Be able to see those when we have the recording of the video afterwards. So in about a year is the highest number of people, with 42 of the people at 52% saying that. So my next question here for the panelists is around the business itself. So we can look at data as much as we want, but what the industry is, the advertising and media industry, whether you're in branded content or display or social, there's people talking to people about campaigns that they're running. Gogi, you're talking to your advertising clients about running ad campaigns as an agency. Matt, you're talking to publishers. Trisha, you're talking to publishers and advertisers. What does it feel like to be meeting from, whether you're in your nicer basement office like Gogi or my basement in North Vancouver? I'm curious to hear how you're seeing changes in the way that we work together. So I'm going to start this one, Trisha, if you want to lead this off and give us some thoughts on how this has changed, good and bad.
Yeah, I don't know. For me, because Press Board is headquartered in Vancouver, I have been working from home, but I often meet in person with brands and publishers. So really the biggest change on my end is doing video conferencing. Yeah, I mean, I'm impressed at how quickly the industry has adapted and innovated. So for me personally, it hasn't changed too much. I think, as a company working from home, there have been some changes, especially some people have kids at home. So finding ways to keep your team collaborating internally and to keep productive, whether it's no longer a timestamp in, timestamp out type work schedule, but getting certain tasks done and jobs done.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting thing where people are starting to, like, we're right inside each other's houses right now. There's a lot of intimacy in that. And I know each of us, I'm surprised that there hasn't been a dog or a baby or anything like that so far. So congratulations to all the panelists. I imagine like right outside their doors. I know I have 2 children that are like just waiting to be able to get into their playroom, which is also in the basement. So I'm impressed with all of us for making it this far. Gogi, I'd like to get your thoughts on working with, your advertising clients as an agency. An agency is often a quite a personal business, relationship building and meetings and kickoffs, etc.
Yeah, I think on the plus side, we are getting a lot more FaceTime with our clients. Everyone seems to jump on in the projects that we have, we can go through. So in some weird way, it feels like we've gotten to know them better. There's obviously a lot of bonding that happens during a crisis. I'd say the same thing about my internal team. I seem like constantly, talking with them sort of face to face in a way that might not happen in the office. So I think that's good. I think that, clearly like the richness of human interaction has gone away. The ability to dream big is sort of scoped down to, smaller. And what I've been telling my team is like, the first few weeks, it was projects that were in the pipeline, and the next 6 weeks, there's projects that were not quite in the pipeline, but you could get done. And then you start running out of the things that were sitting there that can be marketed now. So this has gotten harder and harder for, I think, all of us in the industry and on the client brand side. There's just less and less to do. And we have to start doing more. And I think that's going to be, where I disagreed with that poll. And I was in the 2% that said it will be sooner, is that there's like a little bit of, I think if one company was making a decision, you would say 6 months, take it slow, be rational. And that's like a rational single player game. And then there's this irrational multiplayer game where the first person that goes first gets huge benefits. And, despite wanting to go slow, you start getting pulled forward, probably past your comfort zone because your competitor did something, or a brand, some dealership opened up their dealerships or delivering cars, and now all the other dealerships have to get going, and now they have to start advertising because they got a jump start. So I just think it gets pulled much way forward than you would in your own bubble make that decision.
That's an interesting point, because I've always thought the advertising market is like capitalism on steroids, and you have this highly competitive industries that are, and if everyone pulls back a little bit, then everyone pulls back. But as soon as some of your competitors start aggressively going into the market as an advertiser, you're likely going to have to make decisions as well before someone steals market share. So there might be this, tipping point that happens sooner or later, or at a time that we're not really sure. And it probably will be a few marketers that decide to take a more aggressive approach. Maybe they have like a nice balance sheet sitting there and they're able to take advantage of it. So that's an interesting point. Matt, have you noticed anything different about, you're in Austin right now. You have a sign that says Atlanta behind you. And I think normally you're in New York as well. So anything different geographically for you? I imagine there's been changes as well.
Yeah, it's been interesting watching kind of my 3 core cities react to this very differently. Austin is different, and Austin is very different than Texas as a whole. And my family's all still in Atlanta, and all my colleagues and sort of work friends are still up in New York and are being impacted and are reopening at different stages. So I think Gogi makes a great point there about, there will be somewhat of a prisoner's dilemma effect to this, where people will take action sooner, and that will draw the whole market forward. I think Trisha also said it really well, where, this experience humanizes us, I think, in a lot of respects. In typical client and vendor type of meetings, you may be in a boardroom, buttoned up, throwing buzzwords across the table. And in these scenarios, there's a lot more video calls, and there's a lot more humanizing distractions, like you said, with dogs barking and kids screaming and needing to be fed or let out or whatever may be the thing. And, I think it does sort of level set that we're all going through this weird world at the same time. And there's business that needs to be done, and there's goals that need to be hit, and all that kind of sort of moves forward at whatever is the appropriate pace. But we're still people, we're working together to try to make those things happen. So it's been interesting. You know, you're having, I think, on one hand, a harder time getting meetings and getting people to respond, and from a sales standpoint, necessarily as positively as you might want them to, as quickly as you may want them to. But I think you're building, in a lot of senses, a better rapport and larger, sort of stronger relationships, so that when that other foot does drop, hopefully we're all in a better position, you know, to move all businesses forward in that regard.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. I think we've brought in, I have been seeing the questions coming in, and we were able to answer a couple of them there. I have one last poll, and I'm going to try and give everyone, attendees and panelists, a few minutes of their day back. I know that we have this scheduled for an hour, but if I can give everyone 6 or 7 minutes back, I don't know what you're going to do with that time. Just live it up.
Let the dog out.
Go let the dog out that's scratching on that door right now. So I have one last poll that I'm going to run, which is around this reporting itself. So this frequency of reporting. So I want to thank Trisha, Matt, and Gogi so much for providing this data. This is a really unique scenario where there's no actual affiliation between Pressboard or Outbrain or Gupta Media, but we were able to come together, share this in a relatively short period of time. And I want to thank the panelists for providing that data and their insights on it. So we want a takeaway for the audience here, which is, if you'd like to see this data on a more reoccurring basis, now that we have this nice relationship between us, I know Gupta Media has been sharing this on their website. We're going to provide a link to that afterwards as well. I believe it's also in the chat if you want to access it there. So I'm going to launch a poll here about how often you'd like to see updated data on branded content, native ads, and social CPMs, and we'll do our best to be able to build a report on a more regular basis that makes sense. So your choices are weekly, monthly, quarterly, or I'm good, meaning don't worry about it. So I'm going to let that poll run for a couple minutes here. And in the meantime, I want to thank Trisha and Matt and Gogi for being a part of this, for sharing your data, and for being just so open with letting us into your homes, letting us into your data, and letting us into what you're thinking about right now. So I'm going to end this polling here. I'm going to share these results. It looks like monthly. I'm actually very happy that it wasn't weekly, because I feel like I would have just been adding something new to everyone's plate. But I think this monthly makes a lot of sense. So we're going to do our best to be able to do that. And as I said, there is going to be a recording of this available for everyone afterwards that attended, and those even that didn't attend. And as a closing note, I hope that everyone has a good rest of their day, panelists and attendees. And thank you so much for participating. Thank you to our panelists, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Gogi. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. See you.